Thank you everyone for joining. My name is Kevin Yedid-Botton. I'm a partner and portfolio manager at paraficapital. And for the past 3 years, I've helped oversee and manage our quantitative strategies and technology across the firm. I've had the privilege of knowing Michael for about 3 years. And when it comes to crypto and entrepreneurship, Michael is one of the best in class. He began his journey in the elite intelligence units in the Israeli army, and Michael has made his way to co-founding one of the leading crypto technology companies today, Fireblocks, which is used by Fortune 500 companies, banks, trading firms, and institutions around the world to safeguard and manage digital assets. And on a personal level, I've had the pleasure of also knowing Michael as a friend and colleague for the past 3 years. And when Parafi became one of Fireblocks' first 13 customers, and most recently an investor in the latest financing. And it's been great to see that under Michael's leadership, Fireblocks has become the pioneer in non-custodial technologies for the digital asset space and has grown its client base almost 100-fold from just a handful of users to over 1,000 today. And Fireblocks handles over 15% of all global crypto volume. And it's a pleasure to have Michael join us here today. Michael, welcome.
Kevin, thanks so much for having me, and great to do it again with you. Thanks for all the kind words.
Yeah, no, it's great to have you. And we've known each other at a personal level for the past 3 years. We know there's a lot of interesting stuff to discuss. But in this conversation, I really want to focus on Fireblocks and the role it plays on the infrastructure for crypto. So many people know that the digital asset class has brought custody to the forefront of investing. Previously, investors that wanted to buy stocks never really had to think about how they should custody assets. But when it comes to digital assets, this is something that had never been done before, and it's very different from the traditional custodians in the financial sector. So for those that may not be as familiar with what Fireblocks is, can you explain what it is and how it differs from traditional custodians?
Yeah, sure. So basically, the way that we think about ourselves is as an infrastructure provider for the space that takes care of a few of, I guess, the hardest problems that you face when you start working with crypto. The first one is what people call custody, but essentially it is wallet management, right? And the ability to make sure that you're able to store the asset or protect the assets from both outside threats and inside threats, and do that in a way that is sort of frictionless, right? So I'll explain a bit of the evolution there in a minute, but that basically brings us to the second point, that safeguarding those assets and sort of protecting the private key and the access to the private key and all the policies that needs to be applied when someone is trying to withdraw or access the digital assets, whether this is cryptocurrencies or tokenized assets such as NFTs or securities, is important. But basically, when they need to transfer the assets out, they face additional problems on that front. And if we're talking about some of the more centralized, it's not centralized, it's still the centralized operation, but maybe the peer-to-peer operations where you want to just transfer your assets to an exchange, you want to actually make sure that they are arriving to the right exchange and into your account on the exchange, or if you're trading with a counterparty or selling with a counterparty, you want to make sure it arrives there. If you're interacting with a smart contract in DeFi, you want to make sure that you're interacting with the right smart contract with the right pool. And that's basically the settlement problem in this space. And that's the second thing that basically Fireblocks solves, to be able to do it in a secure fashion. And the fact that we are able to do both of them simultaneously and bring them together across both CeFi and DeFi basically uniquely position us to deal with, I would say, like, the transactional nature of the space and where the space is heading. So, the way that the way we think about Fireblocks, it's really sort of the infrastructure to do the most elementary operations as a user, as an institution that is operating in crypto in a secure and safe way by protecting your wallets and protecting yourself. This is at the core what we do. In the traditional space, because of the way that the market structure is built, those functions are mostly static because they are broken down to the requirements of a custodian to basically usually just keep the books and records. In many cases, even the certificates that are originally sort of assigned, or the certificate of the shares, are even sitting with the depository. And then you have custodians such as the big banks that they are just keeping the sort of ledger of who owns what, and there is sort of this kind of hierarchy of databases. Now, clearly, if in that case the custodian loses that ledger, hopefully they can recover it from backup, but eventually there is kind of certificate that sits in a depository. And this is like, very different from what we're seeing in this space, that from a technology standpoint, if you basically lose the access to the asset, or you selling the asset into the wrong location, because of the nature of the technology and the beauty of it, there is an immediate settlement. This is both the power of the technology, but also the risk that it's non-recoverable, and the technology risk is much greater, and therefore you need providers like Fireblocks that will be able to manage it in a secure way.
And like, you can imagine that, if you're a traditional institution and you're looking to buy Bitcoin or Ethereum and get your feet wet in the digital asset space, and then you're told, hey, you can either trust some new exchange that is unregulated, or some custodian that is not really governed by traditional banking or custody rules, or you can go and take care of your own assets and custody them yourselves. In the last year, you had Silicon Valley Bank, BNY Mellon, become both investors and also make announcements that they were going to use Fireblocks to run their digital asset businesses. What do you think is going through the minds of the institutions that are choosing to go through the self-custody route versus delegating the responsibility to a third party or an exchange? And how does Fireblocks help them solve that issue?
Yeah, I would also add the SCB and a few other banks to that list, but we definitely see this as a sort of common thread among banks, that they are pivoting their strategy into what we call direct custody. I think the reason why we coined this concept of direct custody, because it's a more sophisticated way of essentially managing your keys in an institutional way, compared to, I think, what people think of self-custody, that is more like owning a Ledger Nano. So I prefer to think as all the backup, recovery, availability functionality that you don't necessarily have with some of the traditional retail solutions. But at the end of the day, the essence is the same, right? The essence is that one of the biggest advantage in crypto is the fact that you can remove the counterparty risk of relying on a third party to to operate correctly. So you can take you can basically remove the counterparty risk on the operational risk and also other issues, and that became fairly critical in terms of what we're seeing in the last 2 months, where counterparty risk became something that is less theoretical and really more practical. I think we're going to talk about it shortly, so I'm not going to dig into that issue at the moment. But I think that most of those financial institutions, they do understand the fact that owning your keys and assuming the operational role not only puts you in a better space from a risk perspective, but also unleashes you to create more and more differentiated solutions, right? Because if you're using a sub-custodian, right, for what you want to do, then effectively you are limited by the services that they do, by the compliance framework that they put in place, by the risk framework that they put in place. And while it might sound very simple at the beginning, at the end of the day, it really limits the things that you can do, and you are unable to create differentiation. Because it's a technical or technological space, the differentiation is sort of like driven by your ability to get very close to the operational rails, which is basically the blockchain. And therefore, you need to use solutions like Fireblocks.
As Michael was mentioning, over the past 3 months, you've seen dramatic price action that has led to the collapse and downfall of several of the crypto lending platforms, both CeFi and DeFi alike. And that has brought a lot of attention to your point, Michael, around counterparty risk. Over the past, let's say, quarter, have you seen an increase in client interest for non-custodial solutions such as Fireblocks? Or, said another way, how has the past 3 months of price activity really changed or influenced the product roadmap for Fireblocks?
So the simple answer is yes. We've seen fly from sub-custodial solutions to us and potentially other direct custody or non-custodial solutions in the market. Clearly, I've heard those are quotes that they were calling on their sub-custodians, which are great, very regulated and licensed custodians, and they basically were calling them and say, like, withdraw my funds. And the sub-custodian was asking why, and they're like, look, we don't see, we can't see how we can take the counterparty risk and basically moving funds to platform like ours because of the properties that I mentioned earlier. The reason for that is that, unlike, I would say, us, most of the sub-custodians that you see in the market, they are engaged in multiple activities that reflect prime brokerage, lending, sort of like, vertically integrated trading and so on, right? So not necessarily that they're managing it incorrectly or they don't have great risk frameworks, right? But one would claim that a lot of the CeFi players that we've seen recently going under and filing for Chapter 11 or freezing withdrawals, on the face of it, they also said that they have those amazing risk frameworks. So there is definitely some level of distrust at the moment in centralized entities, and say, like, rightfully so, right? So we definitely seen a shift both forward and also some kind of retroactive shift of people that initially went to self-custody and now sort of realizing that everything that we were saying about counterparty risk is real, and they basically moving to us more rapidly. In terms of our product roadmap, it's interesting because I'm actually now in Tel Aviv with all my product leadership, and we spent the last 3 days sort of readjusting and reevaluating our product roadmap for the second half of the year and for the next 18 months altogether. And definitely we're putting a lot of emphasis around more and more mechanisms for counterparty risk, right? So evolving the Fireblocks network and building more capabilities over there to manage, for people to manage replacement risk, settlement risk, and a lot of risks that still exist in the space. Including how do we build this using DeFi and all the, say, innovative stuff that came out in the last 18 months that honestly were not there or were not mature when we were initially thinking about those concepts. And I do think that for me, DeFi is sort of the ultimate solution for solving these problems. And this is actually something we've seen, and I assume probably was discussed in other sessions, right? But if nothing else, one of the most interesting things that the last month and a half showed us is how much the DeFi ecosystem is more resilient to all those systemic risks compared to the CeFi space. So I think it's definitely compelling to gravitate more and more in using those mechanisms that became extremely mature.
Yeah, so I want to go, you mentioned DeFi, and I want to go back a couple of years to when DeFi really wasn't part of the Fireblocks strategy. DeFi is something that really came around, in a very major way in the summer of 2020 with what we can call DeFi summer. And at that point, really, Fireblocks didn't really have a DeFi specific strategy. And I could have imagined that you didn't really have an idea that you're going to be building a company that would allow users to, buy and sell NFTs or monkeys or lend and borrow on chain. At what point did you realize that DeFi not only was a part of the blockchain ecosystem, but essential to what would become of Fireblocks over the next few years?
Yeah, so I think in that regard, Kevin, I'll give a lot of credit to you guys, right? Because you were our first DeFi user way before the DeFi summer, right? So just to maybe tell the story from my point of view, right? When we engaged with parafi with Kevin in I think end of December 2019, they asked us to build a set of functionalities for them to interact with a few DeFi protocols, which we didn't have those integrations. We did have, I think, we and one other vendors, we were sort of closest to the pin in that regard because we did have a pretty advanced on-chain capabilities. And we basically I convinced basically taking the feedback from parafi, I convinced my leadership to build what was back then the first integration we had with Compound, which was very rudimentary, but that was the first start. We released it back in February 20. And funny enough, I think the blog basically published an article about the launch of that feature. At the end of that blog, there was a quote from one of our clients that basically said, "This is very cool," like a different client, not parafi, but a different client, which is a major OTC. And they said, "This is super cool. We're never going to use it." 6 months later, by the way, they became one of the massive DeFi players. So I always joke with them that it's documented they were, at some point, they were on the wrong side of history. But I think that the strategy was there. I think that this is basically combines the situation that I think that since we started to engage with you guys, I think we started to think about this strategy. But for the first 6 months, no one else was interested, right? There was no real institutional demand for DeFi for the first half of 2020. And for the second half, I would say, of 2020, there was a lot of questioning if this is just a bubble, right? And that was basically why it was a bit difficult to decide how much do we need to double down the strategy. But as we started to think more and more about it, it was clear for us that this is very much real. And I think also we started to understand much better. It basically started to shape the space and make it very compelling to double down on that technology, which is what we did, right? And I think we were very quickly able to understand what people really want there in terms of the market, building the different adapters to connect to different DeFi protocols with wallet connect, with browser extension, with API, take a lot of feedback. There is still a very long roadmap that we have in this space in terms of what we need to do. I wouldn't say that the solutions in the market, including ours, are perfect, but I do think that clients shouldn't be deteriorated from the fact that things are not perfect to step into the space. I think that what we have already is very secure, robust, and in some ways also we have things like Arc that is even compliant and solve a lot of the regulatory issues. And clearly the ability to step in right now and work with people like us to shape the solutions, to shape the use cases in advantage, because then we can partner like we've done with many other people and build the right things and build the right tools to really harvest the huge potential that already exists in DeFi. And I think that basically join the ride of what is being built.
Yeah, thanks for that color. I know we're coming up on time. We have about 5 minutes left, and I want to like take the next 5 minutes or so to really go through a few questions in a very succinct manner. And I want to start with like regulation. So regulation obviously crypto has come into the spotlight, especially over the past few months with everything that has happened with a lot of this key systemic risks that have taken down key lending infrastructure, participants, and counterparties. What is Fireblocks' regulatory wish? If you could have, Michael, your own regulatory agenda for the digital asset space, what would you like to see?
So we spent a lot of time with regulators, and I was sharing with them our regulatory agenda, I think, in the way that we see it. But I would basically say there are two important aspects there, right? The first one, well, the two critical things that need to be solved. The first one is consumer protection, right, which is critical for the safety of the space and being able to, and this space being applicable for the mass market. That is important for all of us. And the second is really to prevent bad actors, right, from operating in this space. This is just probably thematically correct, regardless of how exactly it is being done. The most critical thing for us is that it will be done in a compatible way to the technology, right? And I think what we've seen in the last couple of years is there is ambiguity, so there is no clarity. And sometimes when there is clarity, a good example is, I think, the way that, just to be very upfront, the way that the first implementations of the travel rule are being rolled out, it's just not compatible, right, with how the space is working. Not to say that the travel rule is incorrect thematically, right, but just like the specific implementation of how this is being done. So the way I see it is that all of those things can be achieved for two ways. One, there need to be clarity around disclosures, right? That it would be very clear for the consumer what exactly they're interacting with and activating. And the second thing is that we need to move to something that I call programmable compliance, but basically the ability to use the on-chain mechanisms to really create both enforced consumer protections and some form of anti-money laundering, right? And I do think that it's achievable, and I do think that if we actually implement this correctly, it will be superior in terms of protections to what we see in the traditional space. And this is essentially where we're educating the regulators.
Yeah, and regulators are also very focused on stablecoins. And to your earlier point, you touched on this concept of the Fireblocks network, which, for those that may not be familiar, is effectively a way in which Fireblocks clients and users can send and receive and settle assets within Fireblocks without having to share addresses and other efficiencies. You've seen companies like Circle, Paxos, Silvergate begin pursuing or have launched already stablecoin products. Why is Fireblocks not thinking about, or is it thinking about launching its own stablecoin?
So what we are working on is to enabling people to launch stablecoin. I think that there is a question why won't we do that, but I think that our place is as technology provider to enable those entities to launch stablecoin. The reason for that is that I personally think that you need to be a bank, right, to launch a stablecoin. I think that this is by itself is probably half an hour conversation. But if nothing else, what we've seen, based on what we've seen, there is no current clear path of under collateralized, or there is no clear path right now for under collateralized stablecoin. I think the safety stablecoins are crucial and extremely important part of the infrastructure, and at least at this point, probably it makes sense to have the safeguards of what we used to view as a bank, right? In terms of issuing a stablecoin, I do think that Circle and Paxos, they also have regulatory umbrella that probably will eventually evolve to that.
And as we look to wrap up, Fireblocks has seen a dramatic transformation since its launch to what it is today. As you look ahead 5 years into the future, how do you see the transformation for Fireblocks? Do you think it will be as extreme as it has been in the past, 4 to 5 years, or do you think it'll be more gradual and well paced into really adopting a lot of the infrastructure that has already come into existence?
I think both. So I think that there will be part of I think we're sort of like now crossing into something which looks like sort of like early majority, right? From the innovators and the early adopters. I think some of the early majority will happily adopt what we sort of already have and what we keep innovating on. But in addition, I think that we're seeing new and emerging segments such as Web3 and others that they do require some pivotal shifts in the infrastructure and the way that we're thinking on it. So would we need to disrupt ourselves several times in the next year or two to maintain relevancy? I truly think we do, right? And this is where I'm pushing myself and the team to make sure we stay at the edge of the envelope.
Great. Well, Michael, this has been great as always. Thanks for sharing all your insights, and we'll see you next time.
Kevin, thanks so much for doing this. Great to have this chat.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.